Got three relatively quick topics here on this nugget on advanced file services. If you're following along at home, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, there are actually four different objectives in this objective domain on advanced file services, at least for the test. The fourth of these is the objective on FSRM, the File Service Resource Manager. And FSRM is, we're not going to not do this. It's actually just better for us to talk about it in the context of dynamic access control for DAC. So don't worry, we're actually going to talk about it as it relates to DAC because it just kind of fits better in with that topic. What that leaves us with are these three kind of little individual topics. That means it's a bit of a short day because while these are by no means unimportant, they are relatively easy to configure. I mean, setting up an NFS file share in Windows, once you've got the role service installed, is a relatively easy thing to do. You kind of click a couple of buttons and the file share is available. NFS, as you probably know, is just another file system. It's mainly used for connecting up so that our Linux and Unix machines can connect up to a Windows server. The most common use today outside of Linux and Unix is so that you can get access to your ISO files from a vSphere environment. That's a pretty common use of NFS these days. Some people are actually even hosting VMware VMs on NFS. We are going to talk about configuring branch cache, and in fact the branch cache configuration is probably the most complex of the three, and that's not saying much. Branch cache, I'll talk about here in just a second, is a kind of a nifty little solution for your remote offices in maybe accelerating certain use cases when users need to access content that would otherwise be at your main office. So hold on to that thought for just a second. I'll explain kind of at a high level how branch cache works. We also in this nugget need to talk about how to configure file access auditing, which is a two-step process. We need to configure either in local policies or in group policy the master toggle switch for it. And then once we've done that, we go into our what we used to think of as just simply our NTFS perms, and then look at our auditing permissions as well, the SACLs, if you will. And once we turn those on, we can do some configuration about what are the things that we actually want to audit for. But before we get into the actual configuration, the click by click, I want to take a minute and just talk about this whole branch cache topic, because branch cache was actually was introduced in the 2008 or 2008 R2 days. I can't remember. It was definitely released with the release of Windows 7. And branch cache didn't see a lot of use because in Windows 7, it was only available at the, I believe, the enterprise version of Windows 7. So you had to buy the most expensive version of Windows 7, and one of the bennies was the abilities to use branch cache. Consequently, Microsoft found that just not a lot of people were actually implementing it because of this sort of curious paradox where an organization who had these little tiny branch offices probably didn't want to pay for the most expensive version of Windows for the branch offices. And yet that one of the features of that most expensive version was the feature that helped the branch offices. Well, as a result of that, in Windows 8, branch cache is available in all the editions of Windows 8. You have it available, and it in fact is it's a really cool kind of solution, especially when you start thinking about the ways in which it can be used. So let's think of two different sort of geographic locations here. This is the main office over here on the left, and this is the branch office over here on the right. And in our classic situation, we have here where the connection between these two locations is just not the greatest. Maybe I just have a couple of users down there. And those couple of users, they need to interact with file servers that sit up here in the main office. Maybe there's even a web server that sits up here. And maybe there's even another kind of content server that delivers its contents through bits. Now, a couple of great examples for the types of servers that use bits are your WSS servers and for patch distribution. One great example. Another one is a config manager distribution point, so a bits-enabled distribution point. These two types of servers generally, or they have the ability to download their content through bits, and as a result of that, we can layer that content distribution or distribute that content through a branch cache connection. The really cool part is that once we kind of turn on branch cache, it doesn't matter which of the services you plan on using. If they're bits enabled, or if they're web-based, IIS, or if they're file-based, it's just always going to work. Branch cache will just transparently cache things down in this remote location anytime that remote location meets the, fits the bill for these kinds of services. So down here in this branch location, there are going to be a bunch of workstations, apparently very large workstations. And so I got a couple of users down here, very unhappy little people, because these poor little unhappy people are not accessing their data very quickly. When I enable branch cache, there's a very specific series of events that has to go on in order for my little unhappy people to become happy people. Now, as you can imagine, the first time that a user attempts to actually access a file on, for example, a file server, that file doesn't actually exist in the branch. So the first attempt to download that file will not be accelerated. It's not until at least the second attempt that the second person is going to enjoy the benefits of the cache. So if I draw my little second person down here, he's very happy because, yay, he's number 2, yay, number 2. So the first time, obviously, we have to download that content. The content has to come down to some location here in the branch cache so that happy number 2 guy over here can access that content from the cache. Well, Microsoft they added some smarts into the way the branch cache works, because they realized that having a server down here as the location where this stuff comes to is okay in certain circumstances, but this is a branch office. Right? The whole point of this is not to have a bunch of locally available server resources in this branch office. So they constructed branch cache in a way where you have an option of using either a server in that branch location or no server at all in that branch location. When you're using a server, we call it hosted mode. Hosted mode. And when you're using no server at all, we call it distributed mode. Distributed mode. In the case where I'm using distributed mode, each individual workstation ends up becoming the location where the content actually gets cached. And when I configure a group policy will automatically set aside a little portion of disk on each person's workstation here as a repository for storing this cached content. Now, don't sweat it because if you have to worry about permissions, because all of the permissions are going to be respected so that a user will not be able to access content that they shouldn't be accessing. That was all designed into this process. And so transparently, if I don't have a file server down there, well, then I can just turn on simply distributed mode and know that if the cache exists, that content exists on somebody's desktop or laptop in that location, well, then we're going to end up with happy number 2 person over here. Again, alternatively, if I want to put a server down there, I can put a server down there and host it in that location. The whole thing is up to you. Now, this is great for file services, and it's great for web services also, but where it really gets awesome is when you start incorporating this, as I said, with the bits services like WSS updates and config manager deployments as a config manager distribution point. It's neat to be able to have that content available, and if it just simply isn't available, so maybe happy number 2 guy is late for work that day, well, then unhappy number 1 guy is going to go, oh man, I've just got to download the content back from the file server back in the main location. So branch cache is kind of a best effort solution for getting content down. If it doesn't happen to be down in that remote location, well, then the users are just going to have to wait a little longer like they're used to have to doing. I'm going to talk about branch cache a little bit later here, the configuration of branch cache a little later in this nugget, because I want to talk about these 2 relatively simple things that we have to talk about, or that are also in this objective domain, which is file access auditing and configuring NFS data stores. And I'm doing that partly because I'm here on my server, on my domain controller, Denver DC1. And in order to do file access auditing, I've got to go through a couple of steps. The first of which is to create either a group policy or a local policy. Obviously, again, don't use your default domain policy. That can either be a local policy for an individual server, or it can be a domain policy that actually turns on, I like to call it the master toggle switch, for auditing. We have to turn on this policy first so that we can actually turn on all the necessary awareness that auditing is enabled. Here under Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Local Policies, and then the Audit Policy will be the original 9 policies for turning on auditing in a Windows environment. These 9 policies have been around for, oh gosh, a decade or more. They've been around for a really, really long time, and they're fairly coarse in terms of their granularity. The one you're looking for is here called Audit Object Access, and when I turn it on, I can turn it on for success or failure audits. Now, many years ago, not many years ago, a few years ago, back in the 08 or 08R2 days, enough people had complained to Microsoft about the fact that audit object access is not really granular enough for needing to be able to audit file access, right? Because object access could be literally any kind of object, any object that this particular policy is looking for. And so Microsoft, in all their wisdom, their infinite wisdom, decided to take these 9 original policies and fracture them, splinter them into an additional 50 sub-policies. They call these the Advanced Audit Policy Configuration. And when you turn on the regular policy, so the original policy, you can also turn on the Advanced Audit Policies here for those and even a couple of more down here under Advanced Audit Policies. There is an additional policy you may want to take a look at here under, let's see, under Object Access, and then there it is, File System. Either or. You can either do it with Object Access or instead of Object Access. This will ensure that you are only auditing success or failures for file system type objects. And this will help you avoid having to go through and audit all the other bits that the audit policies look for, like kernel objects and registries and removable storage and SAM and all these other bits here. There are, I think, like 50 or more than 50 of these individual advanced audit policies, and they just keep getting more and more handy because being able to tune down auditing gets rid of that kind of awful nightmare that auditing has traditionally been. So turn that on first, again, either as a group policy or as a local policy. And then once you've done that, the second step in the process is to actually go to a folder that you want to audit. So here's a folder, my folder to audit. And when I go to that folder, if I take a look at the properties, the security properties of the folder, under Advanced will be an auditing tab that I can enable if I'm an administrator, and then turn on auditing for the folder and the contents of the folder. Now you have to be aware that similar to the discretionary access control list, the DACL that we associated with this folder, we have to assign a couple of different values here for who we want to audit, what we want to audit, and when we want to audit. Let's take a look at all of these. So I'm going to create an auditing entry in here. This auditing entry, first we have to identify who we want to audit. So maybe I'm interested in domain users as the principal. Anytime someone's a domain user, I want to audit their access. I can then define whether it's going to be when they fail to access something, so when they try to do something they're not supposed to, or when they succeed, or both. A common one here is to look for situations when, I don't know, a person maybe fails to access. So when are people trying to poke around and get access to things that they shouldn't? Where do I want it to apply? This folder or this folder, its subfolders and files and combinations therein. What the permissions are that I'm auditing. So what am I trying to watch a person try to do? And then down here at the bottom, this is kind of new, is the ability to limit the scope of the auditing entry to perhaps a user, a group, an authentication silo, or even a device. Some of these things that go much beyond users and groups kind of poke their heads a little bit into the dynamic access control, the DAC feature that we'll talk about a little later. But for now, I just want you to recognize that there is the ability to limit the scope of the auditing entry so that you can ensure you're only paying attention to the specific types of entries or accesses that you're looking for. So do that on every folder that you're interested in, and you will then have auditing. Pretty cool, huh? All right, let me flip back over here to my other server, file1.company.pri. And if you recall, back in a previous nugget, I told you that over here I have installed the NFS role service right down here. So I have installed, in fact, I've installed branch cache for network files, but I've also installed server for NFS down here at the bottom. Server for NFS is a remarkably simple service. In fact, it doesn't do all that much except expose an existing share out over the NFS protocol. So let's say I've got my NFS share here. On a server that has the NFS files for NFS role service installed, well, you're going to see another tab up here called NFS sharing. And it's here where you can enable this folder for NFS sharing by clicking this box right here. The property or the additional configurations that you see here are entirely unnecessary for this exam. Just recognize that you There are configurations here, and that this has to do with NFS, where it is my presumption that the exam does not get any deeper than this. But one thing that you should be aware of is that once you share the folder, you do need to set the permissions for the folder. And NFS permissions tend to be done by server instead of by user. So you'll notice here that we've set all machines as either read-only or read-write. And we can set an encoding here too, but again, this is a level of detail that's far beyond what we want to talk about. Generally, when we set up an NFS share, we're going to set it up and we're going to limit it to the machines that should have access to that NFS share. And that's pretty much, at least for our purposes here today, pretty much all that you got to know. I would be aware that NFS in Server 2012 is now clustering aware. In fact, if we get a little later on and talk about clustering, you can actually host an NFS service on top of a Windows failover cluster. But for the most part, that's about it as it relates to NFS shares. And you can use your NFS client now to connect in. If you're on a Linux box, you can make use of that. The really cool part with vSphere is you can attach to that NFS share over vSphere and just automatically bring all that information down. It's a very handy to create a data store over there, especially when you got ISO files on it. So one more topic here in this nugget. I told you it was kind of a quick one, and that is branch cache. I talked about branch cache. Branch cache is this awesome little feature that allows you to cache things in those remote sites. What you may not be aware is that branch cache actually arrives in two different flavors. The first of which is the flavor that is used specifically for caching files. And that is one that is found right here as a role service under File and Storage Services. So branch cache for network files is something that you would install onto the file server that you intend to cache to that remote site, to that branch site. If you're looking to do other kinds of content, like web content and bits content, there is another type of branch cache, which is found right here. This is done for caching HTTP stuff and bits stuff, but not the file stuff. And these two get people confused all the time. And what happens when people get confused? It makes great test questions. So be aware that there are two different types. There's the feature and there's the branch cache for network files. Once you get it installed onto your server, and I'll assume just for our purposes we're talking about network files because for the most part everything else is the same at the client side. Once you get it installed, we've got a couple of different things we have to do to get the whole thing turned on. One of which is to instruct branch cache to actually generate the necessary hashes. Now what branch cache does is a little bit more intelligent than literally copying files down from one place to another. It can go through an individual file, so if I assume here that this long bar is my file on disk, and chop that file up into blocks, so data blocks. Then for each data block, it can generate a hash of that data block, which is a shortened, you think about it, it's a small number that relates to a large number of data, or a large quantity of data. And then for each of these, create a hash, and then transfer the hash content along with the file. Now the neat part about this is that when the file changes, right, so the first user goes and makes a little tiny change, changes one character in the file, well then branch cache is intelligent enough to recognize that that one character only changed this one block. And so in order to get that file and make that file whole again, the only block that's necessary to get transferred is the block that's changed. That greatly improves the efficiency of branch cache and transferring things down, particularly when we've got files that are being constantly changed. Very helpful here. If I had to transfer the whole file down every time somebody changed something, I'd never get acceleration off of a tool like this. So I've got to use something like group policy in order, or even PowerShell, in order to generate the hashes. And then I've also got to use group policy to instruct the clients to use branch cache for any kind of file services if they can. I'll show you how it's done in group policy, and then I want to kind of point you to a couple of PowerShell commands that if you can't use group policy, you'll be aware of. So I just want to show you the get help for them so you know that those commands exist. Let me flip back here to our domain controller. I want to go back to my default domain policy. Remember, don't do this in default domain policy, create another policy. But the location I'm looking for is here under Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates. And the first place I want to look is under Network and LAN Man Server here. There are, as you can see, two different settings for branch cache. One is the actual instructions to go ahead and publish those hashes, and the other ones are what version do you want to support. When I turn on hash publication, I can turn it on and then enable it for either all shared folders, those on which branch cache is enabled, or disallow. So I can either just say everything on this server, or I can go through and individually identify which folders I want to turn on. Your internal policies will dictate which of these you want to enable. Then once I've determined which of the two I want to use, I can choose which of the two versions of branch cache that I want to lay into place. Now there are two versions. The later version, version 2, is the one that comes in Windows 8 and Windows 2012 and forward. The Windows Vista, Windows 7, the earlier ones are going to use version 1. So if you've got a hybrid environment, I would support the V1 and V2 hashes. But if everybody is Windows 8, well then go ahead and use the V2 hashes alone. That's mainly your difference here between these two. Once you've done this, that's the server side, mainly the server side. Once you've done this, then you got to go through and configure the clients. And the clients happen right here under branch cache. There's a bunch of different settings here, but there are just a few that are very important. The first is to just simply turn on branch cache. Okay, so we got to enable branch cache. And then we've got to set whether we're going to enable distributed cache mode or we're going to enable hosted cache mode. It's here where we identify, if it is in hosted cache mode, what the name of the server at the remote site will be. So what's going to be the server I'm going to look to first to see if there's content in my local location before I actually go to the file server. There's a little bit of extra work here if I'm using hosted cache because I just have to point to that location. Do you want to turn on cache discovery by a service connection point? I'll show you in the PowerShell command here. There's a parameter that says register SCP. All it is a service connection point is built into your environment, the ability to know where your branch cache server happens to be. So it can kind of help with some of this discovery activity here and finding what that server is. For the server, what are going to be my hosted cache servers? Okay, so useful here. However, this is only used when I have machines that are running Windows 8. So previous versions are going to use the other mode. Branch cache for network files. What is the maximum round-trip network latency at which caching is going to begin? So if you think about this, right, if you have a main site and multiple sites, let me go ahead and draw this here. If I've got one main site here, but I've got multiple remote sites, so Las Vegas and Phoenix. If I have a fast connection in one location, but a very tiny slow connection in the other, I'm enabling branch cache on the server. And so I probably only want to enable branch cache when my round trip latency is above a certain number of milliseconds. So when I know I've got pain, wait until you have pain before you actually use branch cache. It is here where I can identify what that maximum round trip latency is going to be. I just figure out how long it takes a ping packet to get from here to there and adjust your round trip latency to suit if you don't want to turn it on globally. If I'm using the distributed cache, so where every computer has its own little mini cache of the documents that are appropriate and that it is downloaded, I can identify what percentage of that client disk do I want to set aside for branch cache. This is nice because it protects you from having those clients just fill up with a bunch of cache data. You see here the default number is actually just 1%. So again, don't let yourself end up creating a problem where you've filled up your local disks down there in that remote site with a bunch of cache data. How long do I want to set the age for the documents that are in the cache? By default, it's set to 28 days, but I can adjust it to a different period if I like. And then lastly, again, which version do I want to support, version 1 or version 2? Now before I forget, there's actually one more setting in here that is easily forgettable because I nearly just forgot about it too. And that is if I go back here when I'm setting up my hash publication and I set it to only the folders on which branch cache is enabled. This is one area that's kind of actually can be difficult to find. Let me go ahead and just create another folder here. Let's call this my, I'll use my folder to audit. Okay, I'm going to set up a share on this folder. And we're going to share the folder. I don't care about the permissions just yet. So this folder is now shared. Where do I identify whether I want branch cache to actually cache this folder? You might be thinking, well, wait a minute, it's not in the folder properties. Well, that is because the location you do it is here within File and Storage Services. It's a little buried. I'm going to go to Shares and see here under Shares, there's my folder to audit. And if I view the properties and show all, I should hopefully be able to see, where did it go? Here it is, Allow Caching of Share. Now with branch cache enabled on this server and correctly configured, it is this setting right here where you will actually enable branch cache on the file share. So you got to have everything set up appropriately, but that's the way that you actually get branch cache turned on. Common, that feels like a test question to me. I don't know if it feels like one to you. It feels like one to me. I would also, let's see here, there are a couple of PowerShell commandlets that can come in handy. One of which we've already kind of talked about because you can also implement it via group policy, but there are two other ones that are not directly addressable in group policy. Let me draw again. So in my world, my lovely little world here, where I've got the main office and the branch office, right? I've got this file server here that everybody's looking for, and I've got my unhappy people over here because they're with no arms. Let me give them arms. With their desktop. Well, when I attempt to put perhaps a hosted file server over here, when I install that file server at first, what is on that file server? What's sitting on the drives of that file server? Nothing, right? Because my unhappy person has to go here to the file server and say, hey, do you guys have anything there? And the file server says, yeah, sorry, no, I don't. So here's a copy for you, and then here's a copy for the file server. Well, the problem with this is that I'm going to put a file server in that location without any content on it. So I want to show you two more commandlets that allow you to take the content on here, generate a bunch of hashes, and then transfer or export that content out so that I can import it then in on my remote file server to kind of accelerate the process of at least getting the first version of that content downloaded. So three PowerShell commandlets here. I don't want to dig too deep into them, but just want to show you what they are. The first is enable BC hosted server right here. There's also, as you notice, there's also a BC hosted client, but enable BC hosted server is the command or the PowerShell way that you can enable branch cache. So you can turn it on and put it in hosted server operations mode. That's just a nice one to have. There's also a BC hosted client if I want to turn that on as well. But the two that are really cool, the ones that are not directly addressable here in PowerShell, the first is publish BC file content. There is also a BC web content too. So BC file content, BC web content. And if I show you the get help here, you'll see that this is this command will create the hashes on a specific path. If you execute it with the stage data parameter here, it'll keep all those hashes in a location that makes them exportable. And then once you've generated those hashes, you can use another commandlet here called export BC cache package, export BC cache package. And this command lets you point it at that location and then export out the package. So I can pre-populate or pre-stage that content down on that hosted server out of my remote environment. So a nice way to accelerate the acceleration, so to speak. And again, a couple of commandlets that I just think these are cool, and they may also be helpful. I don't know. So what have we talked about this nugget? We've talked about three little tiny things here that make up advanced file services. NFS, we talked about branch cache and just the kind of the cool way in which it works. I showed you the way it works with files and file services, but the way it works with bits stuff is even that much more impressive. But what's impressive about it is there's nothing else to show you, because once I turn it on and enable it with bits, it just works transparently in the background, and I don't ever have to really do much of anything else. So I just like how they've made this and kind of a set it and forget it type of solution for those the types of remote offices where you want a set it and forget it type solution. And then we also talked here about file access auditing and a couple of different types of auditing that now exist. The coarse level auditing and the fine grained auditing that we have with our modern versions of Windows. Coming up next, we're going to shift gears and talk about high availability, a couple of different interesting topics, starting with our next nugget on network load balancing. NLB is a way that you can take generally IIS servers, not always, there are other services that are out there, but generally stateless type servers, and put them in front of a virtual IP address so that they can perhaps load balance, but definitely be highly available for the services that they offer on your network. That's a topic for our next nugget. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.